Hello everyone! Today I'm going to be continuing the fighter builds I started at level 1. But today I'm going to bring them to level 2 after having made the series about level 2 on the fighter, and I'm planning to continue this all the way to level 20. So again, I'm going to be starting with the common only, core only build, and I'm going to mention a little bit about equipment for level 2 and fighters. So some quick notes. First off, usually all fighters get a potency rune. In Path Builder, you apply it by going to Weapon, Options, Potency Rune +1. This is a fundamental rune increase, and it's automatically given by automatic bonus progression, indicating that most characters should have it by level 2. Frequently, you gain it near the tail end of level 1 as well. If you're using automatic bonus progression, it just kicks in as soon as you hit level 2. I'm not going to apply that right now because if you're using this build, you should go to your GM and check when do you get it. And the second thing which might happen with these builds is, first off, you might want to upgrade your armor. So you might get full plate if you can, or bastion plate or fortress plate, depending on what you find. And generally, for the melee characters that are relying on strength, like all three of these, full plate is essentially most of their magic item budget goes to full plate and those potency runes, especially for this character that does dual weapon wielding, because you need 2 potency runes to get the same effect. That makes automatic bonus progression a sort of upgrade, because using it, you do not need an additional potency rune. However, if you're using automatic bonus progression, I do recommend favoring the spellcasters a good bit in loot. And now back to the common only, core only. The other thing with shield builds is you might want to upgrade your shield, because right now this character has this hide shield, which is pretty good, but it can burn. So you might want to level that up and get a steel shield. And at this point, you're probably getting somewhat familiar with what you're doing, so you might even consider like tower shield if you're frequently defending people, or meteor shield, or just anything. And you might also get a magic shield. Like for instance here, a fortress shield. This particular build, probably not, but you might consider it with some other builds. I'm really using these as an example to show you how I would go about building and leveling a character. So for this character, what I'm going to do is, just to show how it affects, I'm going to switch the armor to full plate, just to let you see. So right here you can see right now the armor is the same for the most part. However, it also gives Bulwark, which, as shown here, it gives you a +3 modifier to your reflex saves instead of having to use your dexterity modifier, which can be very useful if you dump the dexterity. The other thing you could do is change it to half plate. This is cheaper than full plate. And right here, again, same AC. No difference, no bulwark. So I would save up for full plate. However, I'll go back and set it to hide again. And that's generally the case with all of these. You just raise shield to get to a fairly high AC. Now I'm going to be talking about the feats. So to start, this common build is using reactive shield, which is a reaction which lets you raise your shield quickly. So the reaction is already taken if you don't plan things out. So you might consider not taking reaction feats because you already have 3 of them. Now here, one thing I would consider is aggressive block. This lets you use an additional free action on top of your shield block effect. So essentially you're not using another action, you're just improving what you already have. The way it works is it allows you to add shoving the creature. And then you can sometimes apply off guard if you cannot shove them. And off guard is very useful to apply for your rogue allies because they're relying on it to deal precision damage, which is essentially their main damage output in combat. And I also had another feat selected which might make sense here, which is Blade Break, but it's another reaction, so note that. It allows you to avoid being moved by magical or non-magical effects. Essentially, it allows you to not move unless you're being moved a larger distance, in which case you only move 5 feet, 1 square. So either of these are good for a shield build, but I lean towards aggressive block because, again, action economy, you only have 1 reaction per turn. And then the second thing you get at level 2 is a skill feat. And really, this feat is pretty much flavor. Like, most skill feats are not crucial to builds, regardless of what they do. There's a few exceptions. Like, for instance, if you're doing a lot of medicine, you might want to, take medicine feats. But if you're not, well, it doesn't really matter what you pick. So I'm going to leave that empty here and share it as is. Now I'm going to move on to the 2-weapon fighter damage build. So as a reminder, this one is relying on essentially dual weapon fighting. And you might notice the hit points have gone up on all of these, and there's only a tiny difference at this point. Just like a side note here, which that difference is reflecting how ancestral HP kind of just decreases in importance past level 1. So it's basically don't make your indecision based off hit points at level 1 unless you absolutely just have no other way of deciding. And it can be a decent tiebreaker, but it shouldn't be priority 1. So now talking about this build, as I mentioned before, it's probably only going to get a weapon rune on one of their weapons, and you might even trade out the additional scale mail or upgrade to full plate for another weapon rune, depending on what setting you're in, because you might not be able to purchase them. It just very much depends on the setting. However, here, the class feat, what I would go with here is either Intimidating Strike, which allows you to intimidate a target without rolling an intimidation if you successfully hit and deal damage to that target. And this is very useful for this build because it's got low charisma, and a common stereotype of the samurai, which I'm basing this off, is that they terrify their opponents. So this essentially lets you get that ability without having to invest in charisma above anything else. However, there is one downside to this, which is making you a little more reliant on targeting creatures that aren't immune to mental or emotional or fear-based abilities. So if you're fighting mainly mindless creatures or mainly undead, do not take this feat. You literally won't be able to use it. And you can tell that just by, your GM will tell you. But generally, if you think it's mindless, it can't be affected by this. And then a second thing I would consider here is sleek reposition. Essentially, one advantage of the 2-weapon builds is you have 2 different weapons to play with the traits of. So this build has the katana, which has deadly D8 and a 2-hand ability, and deals decent slashing damage. The second one is the wakizashi, which is agile, allowing you to make additional attacks at no penalty, and finesse, which finesse is what's important for sleek reposition. Because whenever you're wielding a finesse weapon, it allows you to make a melee strike, and if you hit a target that is your size or smaller, since this character is an orc, that is size medium or smaller. And that's something to note because if you're playing a small character, a lot of these abilities are less useful. And then it allows you, if you hit, then you can reposition them, moving them around the board, possibly triggering certain abilities. And if you fail, the target becomes off guard. Again, basic penalty, which is good to apply. And in my version of the build, I'm actually going to go with this because it's creative. You might go for Intimidating Strike if you want the Samurai Flair. Then the second thing here is the skill feat. So with this one, I actually have a few suggestions. First off, a basic one that's always useful is Hefty Hauler. It essentially just lets you carry more stuff. It's very useful if you're in a dungeon crawl and your party likes to pick up every little thing, because avoiding encumberment is important to avoid penalties. The second one, which you might consider, is Underwater Marauder. This one's very situational. It basically lets you fight underwater with no penalties. So if you're playing a campaign where you frequently go underwater, it's very useful to mitigate that penalty, because otherwise, well, you're going to be constantly taking a lower hit roll whenever you're underwater. And really, another thing to note here is any athletics feat is very good for this build, because you have +4 strength and proficiency in athletics, which gives you a +8, which is a fairly high bonus for level 2. So for my version here, I'm going to go with Hefty Hauler because it's very general. Now, you might go for the aquatic one. I would absolutely swap that out if you have an aquatic campaign. You might also be wondering, well, why are you prioritizing the weapon runes here over the armor? I figure, just thinking about it, I should explain it a little more. Basically, this character has high HP. So unless you keep getting hit a lot, more hit points is not necessarily crucial. Additionally, you can always run. Please remember that. In Pathfinder, it is assuming you are playing tactically. So this character has slightly more hit points to make up for lower overall survivability, which means that you frequently want another person to be your tank type person, and you want to have at least one or two other people in melee with you. And now I'm going to talk about the support build. So first off, one thing to mention is you might want to swap around ability boosts. This is just something I didn't do at level 1, but if you switch these to dexterity and swap around the background and get your dexterity high enough, you can do something a little more fancy here. And I have that open here, Staff Acrobat. It is a archetype, which gives you additional bonuses whenever you use a staff. The way archetypes work in Pathfinder is essentially you take the dedication, replacing one of your class feats. And then at higher levels, you can take additional feats from either your class or the archetype, depending on the levels required for each. However, once you take an archetype, you cannot take another archetype until you've taken at least 2 feats. There's a warning on most of these. However, this character doesn't have the prerequisites for Staff Acrobat because it requires 16 dexterity or higher. And to find that in here, I know it's in here somewhere, but oh, yeah, it doesn't show it because don't have the... Yes, if you can't take it, Path Builder will tell you. But right here, it allows you to do a lot more with your staff that you might not already do. My intention is actually to do a swashbuckler build highlighting it because it is very good for that class. However, since that's not an option here, Intimidating Strike is again a decent option, especially since this time, well, it just saves actions. It's less good than the other chance. And then the other one is Lunge. Lunge gives you additional reach, which means you now have 15 feet of reach since you're using a polearm. And it can let you trip up to that range. Basically, it gives you a good deal of control over the battlefield. It also would let you disarm or shove if the weapon has that trait. But in this case, the bow staff only has trip and parry, which parry is still good for survivability. So in this option, I'm going with Lunge since you can use actions for Intimidate, whereas having additional reach is always useful. And now for the skill feat. There's 2 feats I'd like to highlight here as being good options. The first one's Titan Wrestler, which allows you to use athletics actions against creatures up to 2 sizes larger than you, or 3 sizes larger at high levels. Why is this important? Well, the character is a gnome, and gnomes are small, meaning that the highest size you can target right now is medium. With this feat, it opens it up to being able to target up to large creatures. And even a size even more once you're very high level. But we're not there yet, so not going to go into that there. And then the other one I'd like to highlight here is, again, Intimidating Glare is always good. However, since you have high charisma here, you can already intimidate pretty effectively. So I'm going to go in here and do Titan Wrestler to extend the usability, essentially, of this build. And the other thing I'd say is full plate is a must. You want to gun it with this character because it has pretty much dump dexterity. And if you would change around the options to truly dump it, then yeah, you're going to be relying on that for survivability. Now, I'm gonna again just mention you don't necessarily get to pick all of your gear items. Some GMs let you purchase them yourselves, some of them just give items. But with this build in particular, highlight that you want to get full plate eventually, because you're relying on that armor increase. That is all for today. If you have any questions about these builds, please ask below. I will link them in the description of the video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the future.